India is at a pivotal moment in its economic policy toward China. After years of hardline restrictions, New Delhi is now quietly reconsidering its approach, signaling that certain import barriers, tariffs, and investment curbs may soon be softened. This marks a significant shift from the post-2020 stance that prioritized strategic autonomy and security concerns above all else. But the reality on the ground has changed. India's dependence on Chinese inputs has deepened. Global supply chains remain China-centric, and Indian industry is sounding alarms about cost pressures and competitiveness. As a result, economic pragmatism is beginning to outweigh the earlier impulse for economic distancing. Behind closed doors, ministries, policy advisors, and industry bodies are increasingly aligned on a single point. India cannot keep trying to build a modern manufacturing economy while making it harder to access the very inputs that fuel that growth. To understand this shift, it is important to look back at how India got here. After the Galwan Valley clash in 2020, New Delhi responded with an assertive economic toolkit, tightened rules on Chinese foreign investment, bans on dozens of Chinese apps, and intense scrutiny and tariff increases across sectors from electronics to toys. The message was clear. India would no longer allow a geopolitical rival to be embedded so deeply in its economic arteries. The strategy fit into the broader Atmanirbhar Bharat vision, reducing vulnerability, boosting domestic manufacturing, and signaling strategic intent. For a time, there was political consensus and public support. But as the months turned into years, the economic consequences became more difficult to ignore. By 2024 and 2025, a new question began to dominate internal government discussions. Was India hurting China or hurting itself? The data provides a blunt answer. Despite restrictions, India's dependence on China has not declined. It has intensified. The trade deficit with China has surged to a record level, nearing $100 billion in FY 2024-25, more than double the deficit from 4 years earlier. China now accounts for over a third of India's total merchandise trade imbalance, a staggering figure that underscores the failure of substitution efforts. Instead of shrinking, Chinese inputs have become even more entrenched in Indian value chains. The reason is simple. India does not import finished Chinese consumer goods at scale. It imports the raw materials, chemicals, machinery, electronic components, APIs, solar modules, and batteries that enable Indian factories to function. These are not easily replaced, and in many cases, India has no competitive alternative supplier, neither domestically nor internationally. Sector after sector tells the same story. In pharmaceuticals, China remains the overwhelming source of critical active pharmaceutical ingredients, including nearly all of India's supply for essential antibiotics. In electronics, India's booming assembly ecosystem, from mobile phones to laptops, still relies heavily on Chinese semiconductors, displays, and subassemblies. In the renewable energy sector, which the government considers vital to its long-term sustainability goals, Chinese dominance is even more pronounced. Over 80% of India's solar modules and cells originate in China, and imports of Chinese lithium-ion batteries, vital for electric vehicles and energy storage, continue to rise. Even when global giants such as Apple shift assembly lines to India, their value chains still run through Chinese component manufacturers, meaning that trying to block those inputs only chokes India's own industrial ambitions. The result is a structural paradox. India wants to build more at home, but to build more, it must import more from China. This economic reality has fueled growing pressure from Indian industry. which has warned that high tariffs on essential Chinese inputs are driving up production costs and undermining competitiveness. Manufacturers argue that while India taxes many critical imports at steep rates, Vietnam, Thailand, and other competitors import the same Chinese parts at near zero duty, allowing them to produce final goods more cheaply and capture larger export markets. This imbalance, industry leaders say, is neutralizing the benefits of India's production-linked incentive schemes and slowing momentum in sectors the government wants to scale quickly, such as electronics, solar, and EVs. The government has also been forced to confront another vulnerability: China's growing willingness to weaponize economic leverage. Beijing's export controls on rare earth elements and specialized industrial inputs have exposed just how dependent global and Indian value chains still are on Chinese material flows. The message for New Delhi is uncomfortable but undeniable. Restricting imports does not create resilience if there is no substitute waiting on the other side. Against this background, a policy pivot has quietly begun. Internal discussions between the Commerce Ministry, Finance Ministry, and Niti Aayog reflect a growing consensus that India must refine, not harden, its trade approach. The emerging strategy focuses on easing restrictions for non-sensitive sectors, lowering tariffs on essential intermediates, allowing certain anti-dumping duties to lapse, and granting more regulatory flexibility to exporters who depend on Chinese inputs to remain competitive. There is also debate over selectively relaxing the FDI restrictions introduced in 2020, particularly in areas where Chinese capital and expertise might accelerate domestic capability, such as solar manufacturing or critical minerals. The government is not planning a dramatic public reversal, but rather a calibrated adjustment that balances national security with economic necessity. This balancing act is further complicated by geopolitical factors. India is simultaneously pursuing closer trade cooperation with the United States and other Western partners, many of whom want to reduce reliance on China. At the same time, India cannot afford to isolate itself from China-centered supply networks that still power much of global manufacturing.
The result is a strategy of selective de-risking rather than blanket decoupling. India wants to reduce vulnerabilities where they matter most, such as telecom, defense, and critical digital infrastructure, while easing restrictions in sectors where Chinese goods are inputs rather than strategic threats. This is not ideological retreat. It is geoeconomic realism. India now faces a defining policy dilemma: how to reconcile strategic autonomy with economic interdependence. On one side lies the argument for national security, technological self-reliance, and long-term decoupling from a rival that has shown willingness to use economic power coercively. On the other side lies the practical reality that India's path to becoming a global manufacturing hub runs through global, and therefore Chinese, value chains. The government's evolving approach suggests that it now sees the danger of overcorrecting. Cutting off critical supply lines before domestic alternatives exist does not build strength. It weakens the very manufacturing ecosystem India is trying to scale. In the coming years, India is likely to pursue a layered strategy: protect sensitive sectors, diversify wherever possible, and ease Chinese input restrictions where necessary to keep Indian factories globally competitive. The broader direction is becoming clear. India is not preparing to embrace China, but neither is it preparing to wall itself off from the world's most efficient industrial supplier. Instead, it is choosing a middle path, shaped by discipline, leverage, and selective engagement. The era of emotional economic policy is ending. In its place, a harder, more pragmatic doctrine is taking shape, one that accepts that in a deeply interconnected global economy, strategic strength comes not from isolation, but from using interdependence to national advantage.